can all take our seats, we can start. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we are going to pledge allegiance to the flag. If we can all stand, please. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I want to thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Donna Florio. I am a mother of 3 children. I have a daughter who's in the Worcester Public School right now. I spent 2 years on the Worcester School Committee, and I am an adjunct professor at Quincy Community College. I've been there for 22 years and a Massachusetts Teachers Association member. So tonight, I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about the group that sponsors this event. We have Dr. Pesta here as our speaker, and the Common Core Forum sponsored this event. And just to give you a little bit of idea of who we are a parent, citizen-run volunteer group. We don't accept any donations. We just volunteer our time because we believe that Massachusetts should have high standards. And we do not believe Common Core are the high standards. So I began learning about Common Core when I was a school committee member. And one of the things that I realized was that as we were getting more and more money into our budget, we were getting less and less bang for our buck. Less money to spend on the kids in the front line. And what I realized as I kept digging and digging and digging is that we were having money that was used for unfunded state and federal mandates. And one of the biggest mandates that we have that was buried within the budget, is buried into different line items in the budget, was Common Core. And as I discovered the Common Core and the park testing, I realized that that money could be spent on kids on the front lines or for more teachers so we could have a better ratio, that we don't need the advancements and we don't need to support these unfunded mandates. So I started a group about 2 months ago, 2 or 3 months ago, called the Common Core Forum. And we started a group, just a few of us, and now we have expanded our group to probably close to 700 members, about 125 activists throughout the state. We have a Facebook page called Common Core Forum, so if you haven't liked us, we're trying to get to 1,000, like us. We have a website, it's called commoncoreforum.org, and there we try to supply some information about Common Core and some of the things that are happening in the state. So right now in the state, what's happening, just to give you a quick idea, is that in the next, I'd say a couple weeks, each one of your districts, and I don't know all your districts, so I can't really speak from all, will be making a decision whether they're going to stay with the present MCAS testing or they're going to commit to the park testing. And that's a huge decision that only the school committee members with the suggestion of the superintendent can make. So if you do not know when that is going to come up for a vote in your community, please contact your school committee members or your superintendent and find out and get active on that, because that's a huge, huge vote that I don't think that the school committee members even knew that they were going to have to take this so soon. So tonight's speaker, did I get anything else? Oh, yes, turn off your cell phones. Thank you, Mike. Okay, because it interferes with the taping. Thank you. John, did I get anything? Okay, good. I'm just looking for audience and see if I have it. The other thing, too, is tonight's presentation will be that Dr. Pesta will spend he'll be lecturing us for a while, about an hour. Okay, all right. And after that, we will open it up for questions for Dr. Pesta. The only thing I ask is that have your questions be a question. Don't stand up and give us a statement of what you think about Common Core and stuff, because there's a lot of people here, probably I'd say about 150, and we really want to make sure that we get the questions to our speaker. Thank you. So Dr. Pesta received his MA in Renaissance Literature from John Carroll University and his PhD in Shakespeare in Renaissance Literature from Purdue University. He taught at major research institutions small liberal arts colleges and has been active in education reform. He is currently a professor of English at the University of Wisconsin and the academic director of Freedom Project Education. And just a little side note, we were just talking prior a little bit a while ago, and one of the things we noticed that when I was young, I was really not great in English, but I was very excelled in math. And Dr. Duke was very excelled in Shakespearean literature. So at third grade, you were reading Shakespeare, and this is very amazing. So we were, when you think about it, one size doesn't really fit all. And if this was a Common Core time, this might have been a really different path that I would have been on, because I would have experimented with speaking and writing, and I've published some things now, and things have taken a different course for me. I didn't go into it, the math profession. So it's really amazing that we get to be the people we are. In Common Core, it's just very common. It's a common denominator. It's one size fits all. And for me, it's really not the right choice. If you can give a round of applause for our speaker, Dr. Pesta.
Can you all hear me okay? Good. Thank you for being here. This is the 32nd state that we've done a Common Core talk in. 32 now, and Massachusetts is among the most beautiful. And when you live in flyover country like I do, you get a real good sense of why people are so devoted to this part of the country, and seeing it's quite beautiful. So, also you should be congratulating Massachusetts that before accepting Common Core, you had probably the best standards in the whole country. The state next to mine in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Minnesota, so proud of they are the Massachusetts math standards that they only took the Common Core English. They didn't take Common Core math. Because they wanted to hang on to their Massachusetts standards. If it's good enough for Minnesota, people of Massachusetts, hang on to your standards, please. And a couple of things I'd like to always say at my talk by way of introduction. Number one, I want it absolutely clear, please understand, that this talk, and I've given 180 Common Core talks now in these 32 states. These talks are in no way, shape, or form meant to be anti-teacher, anti-principal, anti-school. I have a tremendous amount of respect and sympathy for the public schools. Nobody in these states asked for this. This was handed to you. And you have got to make the best of it. And every state I've been in, it's been the same thing. Right? This comes very top-down from the government and then from the state. And so there's not much room for teachers to protest. And in 32 states, I've had thousands of teachers come up to me and tell me that they're against Common Core, but they can't say anything in school. That they're against Common Core, but if their superintendent sees them at one of these meetings, they're going to be in trouble. So it's a big deal. And I think the best thing we can do to support our teachers is to do everything we can to give them the power to teach our kids as they need them, not according to some overarching standards, not based on text that they have very little input in writing, no ability whatsoever to grade, no ability whatsoever to change. That doesn't seem like a fair litmus test to our teachers. So I'd like to say that as well. Also, this is a hugely bipartisan problem. This is not a Democrat issue, it's not a Republican issue. In the state that I come from, Wisconsin, the biggest defenders of Common Core are Republicans. We have a Republican Senate, a Republican Assembly, and we've got Governor Scott Walker, right? And so the largest impediment to the will of the people of Wisconsin is to get rid of these standards. We had 4 state hearings, and after those hearings, you had even Democrats in the legislature crafting legislation to impede or kill Common Core. And it was Republicans who held it up for a variety of reasons. In other states I've been to, blue states, the onus falls more heavily on the Democrats who control things. So this is a hugely bipartisan problem. And then the other thing I'd like to say to you is, as far as questions go, by all means, I'll stick around as long as you want me to and answer any of your questions, but let's do it at the end. It's a little longer than an hour this talk's going to take, maybe an hour and a half. I want to be very quick, and I want to be mindful of your time. Not everyone will want to stay for the question and answer period. So if we take questions in between, it's going to extend this. I don't want to do that. And the other thing I want to say, too, before I begin, I do not know what goes on in Shrewsbury schools. I have no idea. So inevitably, when I give talks like this in places that aren't my own, there will be people in the audience who might think that everything I'm telling you, I'm implying goes on in your Shrewsbury schools. I I have no idea about that. This may be the best school district in the entire state. I have no idea. So, please, I'm going to give you a broad talk about Common Core, its origins and its dangers. I am not saying anything specific about your schools because I don't know. So the kinds of questions I can't help you with at the end of this talk are, well, I've never seen any of this in Shrewsbury schools, or I can guarantee you that in Shrewsbury schools we'll never allow that to happen. Maybe true. I'm just going to give you a very broad overview, and I can answer those questions for you. Okay? So I would ask that nobody feels defensive about what goes on in your schools here about this. All right. And then how do I like to begin? See, I've given these 180 talks, and I want to see if you're going to be the same way. 180 talks, 32 different states, and it's always been the same. I've talked to audiences with as few people in them as 12 or 13, and I talked to audiences with 11 and 1,200 people, and every time it's been the same thing. Here we are, a couple years into Common Core. How many of you, as you sit here, would argue, by a show of hands, please, that your knowledge of Common Core is vague and murky at the best? That what you know about, and would you please just look around? Do you understand what I'm telling you as we begin? 95% of every audience, and in these 180 talks, I think I've probably talked to about 70,000 people. You add them all together. It's always the same. No one told you what this is. They're still not telling you what this is. This was put into your schools without you knowing it, and the people who support it have not done a very good job of explaining it to you. And that's just for starters, right? Here you are, 2 years into this, a year and a half, 2 years into this, and you come to these talks. Every place we've gone on, why aren't the people who are for this doing this? With so much angst, so much consternation, so many problems with this, so much misinformation about Common Core. Why are the people who support it so adamantly not doing these things? Those are questions we're going to have to answer as well, but that's a great visual to begin. So, with that in mind, let's begin with a brief overview of what Common Core is. Common Core. Common Core is an abbreviated term used to refer to the Common Core State Standards Initiative, a set of national standards for English and math with science guidelines forthcoming. Let's just stop before we even finish that sentence. They call them the Common Core State Standards. I have yet to figure out why. Because the states had no meaningful role in paying for them, in writing them, drafting them, in finalizing them, in verifying them, or in implementing them. It's true that people in most of the states got to see the standards, but not in a way that they could change them. I was in North Dakota a couple weeks ago, and we got into some radio back and forth. I do a radio show in North Dakota, and then the superintendent of North Dakota schools would call in 10 minutes later and rebut what I said. So we never did get to meet face to face. But we did have one exchange when we were on the phone together. And she said, Dr. Pesta, that's just not right. 65 North Dakota teachers saw the standards. I said, well, what percentage of your teachers is 65? Less than 1%. All right. I said, how many 65 teachers saw the standards before you implemented them? Could your teachers make any changes to the standards? Well, no. Could they suggest changes? Well, no. So what was the function of a whole 65 teachers who saw the standards? What was their function? Well, there really wasn't any. And she answered all those questions, I gave her credit. And when I asked her the other question, and would you share with us the criteria, how you picked those 65 teachers to look at the standards, that was when the interview ended. And that's true of just about every state in the union. So they call it the state standards, I suppose, for the same reason they call Obamacare the Affordable Care Act. If you call something affordable and you oppose it, you can't be against affordability, can you? Right? And so these games that we play, and both parties do it, right? This is a bipartisan issue. It's a big problem. So they call it the Common Core State Standards Initiative. I'm not exactly sure why. You'll see in a moment that most of the states that took it without even knowing what it was. So they call it the state standards. Set of national standards for English and math. And how about this little naming trick? The words Common Core are branding so badly across the country right now that they've changed the name of the forthcoming standards. The forthcoming science standards are not called Common Core Science. They are called the Next Generation Science Standards. And as you will see, every subsequent, the other standards that are coming, the history standards and some of the other ones, they're not called Common Core either. It seems to me, what we're told about how overwhelmingly outstanding these standards are, why are we running away from the names? If you open the Next Generation Science standards, you can see them online now. The words Common Core appear 40 different times in the first 20 pages. They just changed the name, right? So that's where we sit. Where did they come from? Well, the Common Core standards in English and math were written by the NGA and the CCSSO. These are, for lack of a better word, two Washington lobbyist groups. When you hear the National Governors Association, it's very tempting to think, hey, that sounds like a good idea. 50 state governors get in a room and bang out education standards. I wish that would have happened, even though it would have been a disaster. Because what exactly qualifies your state governor, who's a Democrat, to write standards? What qualifies my governor, who's a conservative? What qualifies him to write education standards? What qualifies any governor in the country to write an education standard? You understand, right, that if you're going to write a national standard in English and math, or science, or anything else for that matter, it requires a whole lot of things beyond the ability to teach high school math or middle school science. It's not something anybody can do. And so, when you hear the NGA, you're tempted to think, okay, the National Governors Association. Well, what is the NGA? As one sitting governor described it, this is a lobbying group that allows politicians and their aides to meet with activists and constituents about how to shape policy. These are two Washington lobbyist groups. The people in these groups have not been elected to anything. They are utterly unaccountable to you and me, the taxpayers and the voters. How does this happen? What qualifies these two groups to do this? And why would the federal government allow it? Can you imagine any other lobbyist groups who just decided to go ahead and write out education standards? When you think about our federal government over the last 20 years for that matter, the federal government is very, very jealous of its prerogatives, aren't they? That the government clearly defines what its role is, and it's very jealous of people who try to take over from it. In fact, our government is continually trying to expand its reach of influence, for better or for worse. How in the world did this happen? Well, let's step back for a second. Who paid these two organizations? Where did the money come from? Well, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, back in 2008, 2009, ponied up $150 million originally for the activists in these two groups to write the standards. And I see a lot of you taking notes. I think that's wonderful. Let me tell you also, I'll make every single slide I show you today available to you free of charge. When we're done, I'll put up a website, and you can go to that website, and you can get every one of these slides for free, because you don't know me. You don't know me. I urge you to take the slides and verify every single one of them. And if you do, and you find out that I'm not lying to you, because in 32 states at 180 talks, no one has come to me and said, hey, you are telling the truth. If you're the first, you come and let me know. And if you find out that I am telling you the truth, and don't believe me, believe your own eyes, 95% of what you're going to hear today isn't even from me. It's all documented where it comes from. Go look yourself. And if you find out that I am telling you the truth, then I have one sincere request for you. Hold the people who tell you it's wonderful to exactly the same standard. Require them to show you how they know what they say is true. That's how you get to the bottom of this, okay? So who paid for this? The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Hey, let's stop this. As we sit here today, Bill and Melinda Gates have spent $2.5 billion with a B on Common Core. 90% of that money has gone to advertise for it, to give grants to educational organizations to support it. Do you know that the National PTA, the National Parent Association, received two $1 million grants before the standards were even written to begin the process of advocating for them across the state? You can go online. If you type in Bill Gates Common Core, you can find a spreadsheet of every place that $2.5 billion was spent. It will blow you away. Why did 176 Roman Catholic diocese schools adopt Common Core the very first year it came out? Why did they do that? Given that their standards were already significantly higher than public school standards. Why did they do that? Well, the NCEA, the largest Catholic teachers watchdog group in the country, the National Catholic Education Association, has taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Gates Foundation. The Fordham Institute, arguably the only think tank pro-Common Core people ever cite, the Fordham Institute. And why do the pro-Common Core people cite it? Because it's a conservative think tank. The Fordham Institute is 100% committed to Common Core. Oh, and when you look at Bill Gates' list, $6 million of Bill Gates' money to the Fordham Institute over the last 2 years. Follow the money. It always works. And so let me ask you a question. What qualifies Bill Gates to participate in the writing of educational standards? Isn't this the guy who dropped out of college to go work in his garage? And good for him for doing it. God bless him. I hope he makes another $1 billion. But what exactly are his qualifications to oversee this enterprise? And if you're taking notes, which is good, another thing I would ask you to look up is Joy Pullman, Pullman. Joy works with the Heartland Institute out of Chicago. And the Heartland Institute, Joy has written the definitive article on the origins of Common Core. It's been picked up by the New York Times. It's been picked up by the papers in London. And Joy traces Common Core to 5 activists in these 2 lobbyist groups. Chief among them is David Coleman. That's a name you must look up. David Coleman, Coleman. This man has an unbelievable past. And not much of it is devoted, not much of it qualifies him to write education standards. David Coleman, deep ties to the federal government. He was a schoolmate of Arne Duncan, who was our Secretary of Education, right? And beyond that, no sooner did David Coleman oversee the writing, he was the architect. No sooner did David Coleman oversee the writing of these standards than he immediately left Common Core and became the CEO of the College Board, where he is right now transforming the SAT to be Common Core compliant. Now that's what you call incestuous. This guy's been elected to nothing. Bill Gates paid him a lot of money to oversee the writing of the standards, to oversee the writing of, maybe I'm wandering a little too far, that's probably what it is. Bill Gates paid all this money for David Coleman to write the standards. And then no sooner did he write them than he dismissed himself from Common Core and was miraculously promoted to the CEO of the College Board, where the SATs and the ACTs will shortly follow. So think about that for a second. Before you've had even 2 full years to digest Common Core in your schools, to determine whether or not it works for your teachers and your kids, the exams that are going to be used to get your kids into college are going to be Common Core compliant. How does that happen? And do you honestly think that any of this stuff happens without the federal government? Do you honestly think a federal government, and especially this federal government, would allow these people to do this? So it gets even better than this. How did they get into your school? I don't care how much money Bill Gates has. He cannot buy his way into the federal schools if the Department of Education doesn't want him to. If the President Obama doesn't want him to. How did they get in your school? How many of you have heard of Race to the Top? Well, all right, that's good. See, 95% of you are fuzzy on Common Core, but you've all heard of Race to the Top. What was Race to the Top? It was a federal program. It was Barack Obama's program. Back in 2008 and 2009, when the president was stimulating things like banks and car companies, he decided he wanted to stimulate education too. So what he did is he took $5.1 billion of taxpayer money initially, much more has been paid since then, $5.1 billion and set it aside, and allowed states in various levels to begin to apply for that money. I'll give you an example, New York State. New York State took $700 million from the federal government in 2009 through Race to the Top. And that money was allowed to go right into New York's education budget. They could spend it on tetherballs or computers or teachers, whatever they wanted. And the only string to accepting that money was if you took Race to the Top money, you had to adopt the Common Core state standards when they were finally written. That's how the vast, well over 40 states got Common Core, simply by taking Race to the Top money. Sight unseen. Over 40 states took Common Core simply by applying for federal Race to the Top money. Now, you see what I'm telling you? Common Core had no ability to put itself in your school. Bill Gates had no ability to put it in your school. The federal government did through Race to the Top. Now let me ask you another question. I got a lot of them to ask you. They're all rhetorical. I believe
identical to what they are now. And let's say instead of Bill and Melinda Gates, it was the Koch brothers who put up $2.5 billion. And instead of two left-leaning lobbyist groups, you had two right-leaning lobbyist groups. And instead of a very liberal president, you had a very conservative one who basically took taxpayer money and bribed 46 states to take a set of curriculum standards that they hadn't really seen and that they had no ability to change. Do you think most of the people who support the standards now would still support them? The Koch brothers. It almost might be worth it to watch Harry Reid's head explode all over the Senate floor, right? But I tell you, I would be just as bothered by it if it happened that way. And you know, whenever you talk to the supporters of Common Core, they never want to talk about this. They're just standards. Can we just focus on the standards? No, we can't. We're going to get to the standards. You need to know where they came from. This is banana republic stuff. And why do you think the federal government did it this way? Why didn't they just, like national health care, why didn't they just force it through? Well, because of a 1965 federal statute that prohibits the federal government from creating either national curriculum or national standards. That's why. They are legally prohibited from doing so. They can't do it. So they did the next best thing. Each of the 5 members of this small cabal who wrote the standards, and I'll give you some of the other names moving forward. But if you look at Joy's article, you'll get all the information. David Coleman's the one you need to know. But each of these 5 individuals who wrote the standards have deep and profound ties, both to the Department of Education and to President Barack Obama. David Coleman is a huge money fundraiser for Barack Obama's 2 election campaigns. Here is the first shocking thing I'm going to show you. This is the actual copyright for Common Core. The MGA Center and the CCSSO shall be acknowledged as the sole owners and developers of the Common Core state standards, and no claim to the contrary shall be made. So, the people who own the curriculum that is in the process, the standards, that are in the process of transforming America's schools, public and private, are unaccountable to the Department of Education, to the Senate and the Congress of the United States, to the governors, to the states, to the teachers' unions, to the teachers, the principals, the superintendents, and the moms and dads. That's what I call banana republic. What enables these people to do this? Even if you think you like the standard, how can you accept how this is done? And if you don't like them, what mechanism do you now have to remove them? Who do you elect out of office? You can't go after David Coleman. He's busy making $100,000 a year to transform the ACTs and the SATs. Who are you going to go after here for this? And this is the kabuki dance we do about Common Core. When you say it's a federal, and I'm telling you this is federal, because the Race to the Top program, a federal program, is what got it in your school. And when you say that to some of your administrators or principals who defend this, they're going to say, oh, now here's the copyright. It's not federal. This is the game that we play. Right? You look this up for yourself, and this is exactly how it happened. That's the copyright. One last little history lesson here, by way of comparison. Who can tell me what the last big state federal standard education program was that Common Core replaced? No Child Left Behind. And in the interest of absolute bipartisanship, who gave us No Child Left Behind? President Bush. Now, interestingly, you'll surprise me. Every talk I've given in New England so far, nobody's been able to answer this. But we've got some people here who I know because they've heard me before. So if you heard me before, don't answer this. George Bush didn't write No Child Left Behind. Who did he turn it over to? Ted Kennedy, Massachusetts, right? Teddy Kennedy wrote No Child Left Behind. And it was an absolute disaster. I have never yet, and I'm still waiting for the first one, maybe he or she is here tonight, I'm still waiting for the first teacher, principal, superintendent, somebody to tell me that they have anything but contempt for No Child Left Behind. It's a disaster. Every teacher I've ever talked to, every principal, they hate it. Why do they hate it? For 3 reasons. It's outcome-based education. You're focusing not on the kids that you get in your classroom and where they are when you get them, but the idea is you have to get them to this arbitrary standard that you set. Oh, sure, the standard may be higher than what you've had, or in the case of Massachusetts, the standard may be lower than what you had. Can you get your kids, your 3 daughters and your son, your 3 grandkids, your 3 granddaughters and your 4 grandsons, can you get them to perform at even relatively the same level in all the different subject areas? Of course you can. And if you can't do it with your kids, how do you expect your teachers to do it with 60 million American school kids? It's not possible. Do you know also, there is not a shred of scientific evidence, zero, that simply having state standards or national standards, even high national standards, there's not the slightest shred of evidence that simply having standards has 1 little % worth of impact on how your kids perform in the classroom. Zero. There have been 40 studies done in the last 50 years. Simply having or professing or declaring or tattooing standards on your forehead, it does not have any impact at all on how your kids perform. And if you'd like to see the most recent set of data on this, just last year, the Brookings Institute, left-leaning Brookings Institute, published the most comprehensive study of its kind that finds absolutely no correlation between standards and performance in the classroom. And let me try to dispel, can we put one other red herring to that? This weird idea that if you don't support Common Core, you just don't support standards. Can we just put that to bed? Because education, by definition, is standards. If you're doing grades and giving quizzes and assigning letter grades, if you're doing all that stuff, you have a standard. Sometimes, as I said, the standards are better, sometimes they're worse. Education, by definition, is standards. So this outcome-based education, what do? We set up an arbitrary standard, and the job of the teachers, if you're going to do a national standard in education, every kid in every classroom across the country is going to get to the same place. What's the only mechanism you have to measure that standard? Tests, right? And they call it high-stakes testing, don't they? And who's it really high stakes for? Oh, yeah, the kids are getting left behind. No Child Left Behind left a lot of them behind. But it's really high stakes for the teachers, right? Because if you're a teacher who can't get your kids to the standards, conceivably you might not get tenure, you might not get reappointed. If you're a principal who runs a school that routinely falls below the standard, well, you might be reassigned or lose your job, right? That's the high stakes. And how many of you remember under No Child Left Behind what happened in 2006 and 7 and 8, places like Atlanta, Georgia, New York City, North Carolina, where you had teachers, principals, and even 2 superintendents of schools who were taking the kids' standardized tests and throwing them in the trash and forging new ones. And you know why? Because you can't get 60 million kids to one arbitrary standard. And why would you want to? Donna mentioned at the beginning here, all kids are different. The world needs more than CPAs. No offense to CPAs. Right? The world needs more than that. So what if a kid like me was really good in English and really, really bad in math? When I was in 3rd grade, I had, for some weird reason, I did nothing to deserve it, but I had almost a college-level reading ability. So they let me read college-level books. That's probably why I entered the high finance world of English professors. But in 3rd grade, my math skills were decidedly 2nd grade, and they still are. I can balance a checkbook, I can more often than not figure out how to leave a tip, and that's it. So what? According to the new standards-based systems, we have to write that injustice in the first place. It's unfair that I could read that well, and so consequently, we have to find a way to level that up. And my math skills, which were just a little subpar, because the interest of fairness, we had to sacrifice a whole lot to get me to come up just a little bit. Right? Standards-based education. That's why they have to do all this cheating with these tests. And it's also, if I may say so, one-size-fits-all education, isn't it? Right? It's cookie-cutter education. All kids aren't alike. All kids will never be alike. This endless procession of pedagogical whimsy designed to make our kids all the same is borderline Orwellian. And can I say this too? If at this point you want to tune out, maybe you've been giving me a fair shake till now, but you're looking for a reason to tune out and not pay attention to me, let me give you one. All right? Please explain to me why outcome-based education isn't a lot like
socialism.
Sorry. Please explain to me why it's not. I'll get back here. Please explain to me why it's not. Rather than accounting for the fact that your kids may or may not be particularly good in a certain subject, they may not try as hard, they may have difficult family situations, a whole host of reasons why kids, when you get them in the classroom, might or might not be able to do well at certain things. But the premise of outcome-based education is that it doesn't matter whether your kid's smart or not in a certain subject. It doesn't matter whether his attitude is good or bad. It doesn't matter if she tries or doesn't try. All that matters is when you're done, everybody's in the same place. Isn't that socialist? Seems to me. And you know, the irony is we've been doing outcome-based education for about 50 years, and it's never worked. But name me the last time that the federal government decided, okay, our big totalizing scheme isn't working, let's break it up. Does that ever happen? No. And so here's what I'm telling you Common Core is. Common Core is just No Child Left Behind on steroids. All the worst aspects of No Child Left Behind are Common Core. It's the endless high-stakes testing. It is the ridiculous, the standard is even more arbitrary and broad. It's the one-size-fits-all, ratcheted up to dramatic levels. So what's the big difference? There's a couple of them. Here's one of them. What was it that killed No Child Left Behind? It wasn't the federal government repenting of their folly. It was the fact that Teddy Kennedy's program left enough state and local control so that working teachers in working classrooms and moms and dads realized it wasn't working. Common Core, No Child Left Behind was killed from the ground up. There was enough dissent, there was enough freedom in No Child Left Behind for teachers to do things that weren't No Child Left Behind if they were working. The tests weren't nearly as comprehensive and rigorous. They fixed that design flaw in Common Core. Arguably, the biggest difference between Common Core and No Child Left Behind is if this gets fully implemented, you will not be able to kill it from the ground up. Look where we sit here today. The moms and dads argue, and I've never yet met, and the teachers are right. You want to blame the teachers for your struggling kids? I don't think that's completely fair. Our kids are struggling first and foremost because there's a terrific lack of parental involvement. Teachers will tell you that, right? The single biggest impact on how your kids perform is you, moms and dads. Then the teachers, and then it goes up the ladder that way. Think about this for a second with regards to your teachers. This notion about the No Child Left Behind. Working teachers were able to see it wasn't working with moms and dads. Look at you where we began this lecture today. You're the key piece of this puzzle, moms and dads, and you are the ones who know absolutely the least about it. I talked to thousands and thousands of teachers of Common Core, and they still can't tell me what it is, or why they're doing it, or ultimately what the purpose is. So you don't know, and the teachers don't really quite know what to make of it. And I talked to already about 6 of you before the meeting who told me you've been to try to talk to your principals, your superintendents, your school board members, and they can't tell you what it is, not in a meaningful way. You see the difference between this and No Child Left Behind? It is a totally top-down paradigm. You're not going to get out of this from the ground up. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And you're not going to be able to fix it. Right now in your schools, in No Child Left Behind schools, if you have a problem with a book that's being read or a sexuality issue or a movie that's being shown, you can go up to your teacher and you can ask your kid out. 99 times out of 100, easy peasy, that's the answer. But ask yourself this question. If every subject now has to conform to a national standard, they're even making Common Core standards for gym class, art, and music. And it's going to have to conform, and they're going to have to be tested. Everything. The minute they get this all fully implemented, if they ever do you think you're going to be able to opt your kids out of something that is going to have to be tested national? You know what's going to happen? Your teacher's going to tell you, I can't do it. Send you to the principal, going to send you to the superintendent. Somewhere along the line, someone's going to hand you the number for 1-800 Department of Education. How much Muzak do you think you're going to have to listen to before Arnie Duncan picks up the phone? It's a serious question, because you haven't had your first test yet, not your first national one. Do you know there are 3 states that did? There are 3 states in the Union that have had Common Core 2 and 3 years longer than you. Those states are Florida, New York, and Kentucky. 1 red state, Kentucky, 1 blue state, New York, and 1 oddly squishy purple state, Florida. All 3 of them, after 2 years of localized Common Core testing, all 3 states want out now. All of them. They're desperate to get out. Governor Scott of Florida just passed a law precluding Florida kids from ever taking a single national test on Common Core. Don't you see by doing that, that makes it not federal anymore? That's a good start. And if you're dealing with the question of park or no park, no park. Let me tell you why. Because if Common Core, it will be wonderful 2 years from now, and 3 years from now, and 5 years from now. And if it is so wonderful, like they all tell you it will be, then get on then. But you jump in the park now, you aren't getting out again anytime soon. Why not stick with it as it's exactly right? Even if you think Common Core is wonderful, it will be wonderful in 3 years. What is lost to Massachusetts? You have a much better infrastructure than most states. Even if you teach Common Core, which I don't advise, but even if you keep it, and keep your eye on it, but get out of the park testing, then if it's wonderful and I'm just an idiot, go ahead and jump into it in 3 years. But if it's not, and you get into park right away, then you're on the hook for a whole bunch of stuff. You see what you've done on the federal level? Why? And whenever you throw this out there to the people who support it, they get really cranky, but they don't have an answer, because there is no answer. There's no reason on earth your kids need to jump into this right now. As a matter of fact, couldn't you make an argument that if you think Common Core is wonderful, if you give the Massachusetts teachers 3 years to wallow in this wonderful set of standards, that they're going to really be much better at it when you go to test them? That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? But the people who support Common Core will not postpone the test. You have a real opportunity now to send a message. Get out of park. You can always come back to it later, and then watch how all the other states in the unions are running away from it. You do know, right? 4 states didn't take it to begin with. Now you've got Indiana, Oklahoma, and South Carolina in the last 2 weeks have all gotten out of it. Missouri is next, and there's others coming. So you're rushing to get into something that right now 28 of the 46 states that took Common Core are desperately trying to get out of it. There are over 300 pieces of legislation crafted in 40 different states to remove Common Core completely or mostly from those school states. Why are you getting into it now, right? This is a big question for us. All right. It gets even better. Because back in 2008 and 2009, the two chief lawyers at the Department of Education, they both quit over this and called it a federal takeover of education. And by the way, these two guys, they have since written a book together that they just published 2 weeks ago. I haven't read it yet. It's called The Coming Federal Takeover of Education. Here's what they said. In imposing the Common Core standards and the aligned assessments on the states. Do you see the two main reasons this is federal? The feds put it in, and the feds do the testing ultimately. Do you understand that makes it federal? In imposing the Common Core standards and the aligned assessments on the states, the federal government is violating 3 statutes and has put America on the road to a national curriculum. With respect to the race to the top Common Core scheme, because you can't separate them. There is no Common Core without race to the top. Robert F. Eitel and Kent D. Talbert, former Deputy General Counsel and General Counsel, respectively, of the U.S. Department of Education, concluded that, quote, these standards and the tests will ultimately direct the course of elementary and secondary study in most states across the nation, running the risk that states become little more than administrative agents for a nationalized K-12 program, and raising a fundamental question about whether the department is exceeding its statutory boundaries. We've heard that phrase before, administrative agent. I've heard it in Massachusetts, just like I've heard it in New Jersey and Wisconsin, this idea that F comes from your school. This is Massachusetts. We've got good schools. We'll be able to control this. We'll take the standards and use them as a baseline. Think about what he's telling you. We have a parallel for this. It's called the Affordable Care Act. You know how all the states that are in Obamacare now, they have to go ahead and do these state agencies? And what does the state agency do? Can the state agency give you a different health care plan than the federal one? No, what do the state agencies do? They become administrative agents for the federal program, right? In other words, the states become little more than secretaries, bookkeepers, and money collectors to enforce the federal health care law. How can it be any different with Common Core? How can it be any different? Where is your state autonomy going to come from? Oh, and by the way, if you're on a state school board, ask yourself this. What good is the state of Massachusetts school board, and even the local district ones? What are they going to do when all of this is controlled and run out of Washington, D.C.? What are they going to do? And you keep hearing about how this is totally voluntary, Common Core, despite how I showed you it got there. This was totally voluntary. We're not required requiring anything from anybody. Well, what happened 2 weeks ago when Indiana pulled out? Indiana pulled out, and the feds came, this voluntary program, feds came to Indiana and said, hey, you can pull out. But if you do so, we are withholding your entire $220 million federal education budget. And unless you prove to our satisfaction, the Fed said, that whatever you put in place of Common Core is as good as Common Core, we are going to take away your waiver from No Child Left Behind. Does that sound voluntary? Wow. So they bribed states to take it. And now they are blackmailing states to try to get out of it. How do you equate that with transparency, open-mindedness? Oh, it really does seem, doesn't it, like the federal government has a whole lot of esteem for the local control of Indiana. Because now that they want out, we're not going to give you a penny of federal money, and we're going to punish you another way. You think that's not going to happen to Massachusetts? It already is. They go on further here. Oh, and that's the other little trick I should tell you. Remember the Race to the Top program? Yeah. The way it got in your school, the federal program? Not only did the Race to the Top application give billions of dollars to the state simply to accept them, the standards, any state that took Race to the Top money, they also got a waiver from No Child Left Behind. Do you see how insidious that is? All our schools and all our teachers, they hated No Child Left Behind. So here's $700 million, New York, and we'll get you out of that really, really crappy program. And all you have to do is take a set of standards you haven't seen. Is that what you call double jeopardy, triple jeopardy? Right? That's how it happens. They go on, our two lawyers. The Race to the Top application, the initial vehicle through which Common Core was imposed on the state. This is a direct quote from Race to the Top. It requires applicants, the states who took it, to adopt, quote, a set of content standards that are substantially identical across all the states in the consortium. How do you square that with your freedom to do what you think you want to? That comes from Race to the Top. And before you say to me, Dr. Pesta, this is all well and good, but it's not the standard. Yes, it is. You cannot divorce the standards from this because they work hand in glove. It is the Race to the Top, the federal program, who's telling you how you will and will not use Common Core. That matters. Quote, that states adopt a set of content standards that are substantially identical across all the states in the consortium. This means states must adopt Common Core word for word along these paradigms. Oh, and here's something that you might think is wonderful. Common Core, the Race to the Top application also says that, quote, states may supplement the standards. You can add to Common Core, but only if the additional standards do not exceed 15% of the state's total content for that area. So 85% of it has to be the same. But generously, Common Core, the federal government, I should say, Race to the Top, will allow you to add up to 15%. Now ask yourself a question. I know I keep using that phrase. But if Massachusetts can do things 15% different than Ohio, who can do things 15% different than New York, how do you test that? Well, wouldn't you have to make 50 different state tests? Or, that's exactly right. The feds have already said you're not getting it. In fact, if they did 50 different state tests, that'd be better, because then you'd have a lot of state control over the test. That 15% will never appear on the test, because if there's just a big national test, they can't accommodate all that. New York found it. Why do you think New York wants out? Because the first year they had it, they spent their 15% trying to unteach a lot of the stupid stuff that Common Core was forcing them to teach. Then came their first test, and what happened? Not a single thing other than Common Core was on the test. And so the next year, it was all Common Core. In fact, I'll show you the slide in a moment. Bill Gates said in 2009, direct quote, when the tests meet up with the standards, the curriculum will follow as well. That's a direct quote from Bill Gates. I'll show you the slide in a minute. You understand back in 2009 what he's telling you? You don't have, once the tests kick in, by design, you will not have any flexibility. You will have to teach what the tests tell you to. I'll show you the quote in a minute. You can at least take the word from the man who paid for them, right? There is no provision allowing any state to subtract anything at all from Common Core. None. Now, I'm going to take a short digression here. It's not a digression at all. Because whenever people listen to talks like this, or anybody across the country talk about this, the only answer the teachers, the schools do very little to try to explain why this is wrong. They simply accuse who's ever making these accusations, and they're not accusations because you can look up what Talbert and Eichel said. You can look all this stuff up, right? The minute I'm done talking to you, it doesn't matter about me anymore because you'll have all this information and it's yours. You verify it. But I want to take a few minutes and show you, if this is just a right-wing problem, if it's just a bunch of mouthy right-wingers, tinfoil hat wearers, Tea Party morons, if that's who's the only one complaining about this, let's take a look at some of those right-wingers. Let's start with the New York State Teachers Union. Is there any way you could take those 5 words, the New York State Teachers Union, is there any way you can take those 5 words and rearrange them to make it a right-wing statement? I can't think of any way, right? And yet, look at the date here. In January of this year, January 27th, 2014, the Board of New York Teachers Union on Saturday, the 27th, unanimously voted to withdraw its support for the Common Core standards as they are being implemented, and they declared no confidence in the superintendent of schools who brought it to this state. The New York State United Teachers, a union which represents more than 600,000 educational professionals in the state, is also asking the Board of Regents to remove State Education Commissioner John King from office. And although it previously backed the standards, the union says it will not support the educational benchmark as either implemented or interpreted. No dice. That's the New York State Teachers Union. But it gets right-wingers. How about these right-wingers? How about the NEA? How about the largest, most powerful teachers union? Check that. The largest, most powerful union in the country, period, the NEA. What did they say in February of this year? 1 month after New York. The nation's largest teachers union is pulling back on its once enthusiastic support for Common Core, labeling the rollout, quote, completely botched, unquote. National Education Association President Dennis Van Roppel said, quote, the standards will not succeed without a major course correction, including rewriting the standards and revising the text with teacher input. Yeah, you heard that right. The single thing that measures your kids' performance is the test, and your teachers had no say in writing them. They don't get to grade them. They don't even get to see them. The tests in New York that were just taken were 100% sealed and confidential. All your kids get is grades. How are you going to know, first of all, if the tests are even being graded fairly if you don't get to see them? How are you going to be able to know what to fix if you don't see the questions they're getting wrong, but you're not allowed to see them? That's the NEA. Right-wingers? And my personal favorite, how about 1 month ago? How about May of this year? How about the Chicago Teachers Union? Barack Obama's backyard? The most radical progressive teachers union in the country? You know, Chicago's union. The one that 2 years ago approved a curriculum that would begin teaching masturbation techniques to 5-year-olds? That Chicago school system? How about that? May 7th of 2014. And before we go on here, that's Karen Lewis, the president of the Chicago Teachers Union. If you walked up to Karen Lewis on the street and said to her, hi Karen, you're to the left of Bill Ayers, she would shake your hand and thank you for the compliment. Just look at her page. Just look her up. This woman is an anarchist. Evidently, she's opposed to Common Core, a right-wing anarchist. Here's what Karen Lewis said 1 month ago. I agree with educators and parents from across the country. The Common Core mandate represents an overreach of federal power into personal privacy, data mining, as well as into state educational autonomy. Yeah, that's right. This is the Fed taking away your state and local control. She goes on to say, Common Core eliminates creativity in the classroom and impedes collaboration. We also know that high-stakes testing is designed to rank and sort our children, and it contributes significantly to racial discrimination and the achievement gap in America's schools. That's right-winger Karen Lewis. Barack Obama's backyard. Oh, and it gets better. The entire Chicago Teachers Union crafted 30 pages of resolutions condemning Common Core. Alas, I could only show you a few here. Here are a couple of them. The CTU, the Catholic Teachers Union resolution declares, signed by all union Chicago teachers. The CTU resolution declares that, quote, instructional and curricular decisions should be in the hands of classroom professionals who understand the context and interests of their students. That was not done with Common Core. Those are not the people who wrote the standards. They're not the people who wrote the textbooks. And that's the third leg of the stool. You got the federal government to raise to the top. You got the people in the Common Core committee, and then you got the textbook companies. Do you know who the second largest private donor to Common Core is after Bill Gates? It's Pearson Publishing. Yeah. Pearson Publishing owns 100% of the Canadian textbook market. That's all. Pearson owns an absolute monopoly on Canadian textbooks. They currently own about 80% of the American textbook market. In the last year, Pearson has brought up 40 different small American presses, paying 4 and 5 times what they're worth. Pearson Publishing, just 2 weeks ago, was awarded a federal contract to grade every single Common Core test your kids take. Pearson, not teachers, not the teachers union, Pearson. Do you know that Pearson Publishing makes $30 off every single test taken? See, I'm being a bad math person. Can somebody tell me what 30 times 60 million is? Do you also know that the new national test that Pearson's working on, they have included a mandatory 30% failure rate. These tests are constructed so that a minimum of 30% of American kids will fail them. Why? Because then they'll have to take them again. This is Pearson Publishing, right? And if you don't believe me, just ask Karen Lewis. Ask the entire Chicago Teachers Union about this. They go on to say, right, that classroom professionals, this is what I said at the beginning, this should be, if we're going to hold our teachers, if we're going to put metaphorical guns to their heads over these standards, then shouldn't they be in charge of the test? Shouldn't they be the ones who write them, have the ability to correct them, have the ability to see them and compensate for them? And I guarantee you, there's not a teacher in this country, I certainly hope not, who would craft an exam designed to fail 30% of our kids. But that's Pearson, right? How about this? They also say that the education of children should be grounded in developmentally appropriate practice. That's another biggie, as we will see in a few moments. Whatever else you say about Common Core, it is way too much sex, way too much violence, way too much developmentally inappropriate stuff at every age level. We'll get to that in a minute. But that's Karen Lewis and the Teachers Union telling you that. How about this? Common Core standards were developed by, quote, non-practitioners, unquote, including text and curriculum publishers and educational reform foundations like the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, Achieve Inc., right? Who's driving this? It wasn't teachers. They didn't ask for this. They were grateful to be out of No Child Left Behind, but they didn't ask for this. Who's driving this? Well, even beyond the feds who's driving all this change, it's these corporations. Do you honestly think Bill Gates is in this for the goodness of his little heart? It's been estimated that 70% of American school districts, 70, will require moderate or serious computer upgrades to be able to handle all this testing. Whose computers do you think are going into those schools? You think it's going to be Apple computers? No. Common Core standards were developed by non-practitioners, including test and curriculum publishers and education reform foundations. The resolution says that, quote, as a result, the standards better reflect the interests and priorities of corporate education reformers than the best interests and priorities of teachers and students. That is why the Occupy Wall Street movement, that other bastion of right-wing kookery, that's why they oppose the standards. Because of the huge corporate crony capitalist element behind it. That's Chicago. This is Joshua Katz, a middle school math teacher from Florida, a self-professed Democrat and liberal, who's also going on a
Our toxic culture of education begins with a classic supervillain archetype. I focus on Syndrome from The Incredibles. The supervillain's plan is to unleash the doom onto the world that only the supervillain can stop, thus gaining all the desired power. Now, this is exactly what happened in education in the 1980s and before, and then culminated in No Child Left Behind. Private education companies realized they could use public education, a multi-billion-dollar industry, to create a nearly endless stream of taxpayer money. They channeled millions of dollars into lobbying efforts and focused on two words, rigor and accountability, and put everything into place. State statutes were passed, district rules were enforced, and then finally No Child Left Behind became the national standard. Don't get me wrong about politics. These efforts were underway long before they were passed, so both parties get to take full credit for their disastrous results, especially with race to the top. We somehow took the education system that produced the individuals who put a man on the moon with technology less powerful than the phone in my pocket and characterized that education system as a failure, using the word accountability. We only had one way to address accountability: standardized testing. So we implemented standardized testing. And then a 1983 publication called A Nation at Risk showed standardized tests proved schools were failing, teachers were failing, students were failing, and when everything is failing, guess what we need? New textbooks, new workbooks, new resources, new training, accountability systems, new schools, private schools, charter schools, and who is it that creates all of these things that all of a sudden we need? Our supervillain, private education companies. The only way to feed a business model in this toxic culture of education is to perpetuate a picture of failure. I would love to meet any education company that has a business model that is built upon long-term student success. There simply is no money in long-term student success. Now, how is it that we can believe that a standardized test is what accurately measures student achievement? How can we believe that it measures student growth? That moment when the student's light bulb is finally lit, aha. That moment when a student says, thank you for helping him graduate with a 2.0 GPA. How can we attach a number to that moment when a third grader finally has the ability to write his own name? Who, by the way, has been labeled as a failure for himself, his teacher, and his school. Yet we crave education standardization. We believe we need these high-stakes tests because we eat up the misinformation provided by these companies and policies using a false validity of their testing results. Our testing culture begins in elementary school. Colleagues of mine work with third graders who suffer from anxiety from high-stakes testing. From a one-day, one-shot, 4-hour computer-based test, the future path of the student is set. An academic identity is established, and a message is delivered loud and clear: either you can or you can't make it. And no matter what the teacher tells the student about how good they are or what talents they have, if the student doesn't score well on that high-stakes test, the third graders know exactly what it means and begin to define themselves. And it's starting to happen now in kindergarten. So we continue this barrage of standardized tests, and the students continue failing. And the districts have to continue the next initiative that can solve the problems. Who is it that manufactures these products? Who creates these solutions? Our supervillains. Private companies like Pearson and McGraw-Hill, who operate off policy and legislation written by nonprofit organizations and lobbying groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. The Common Core will do even more damage because of its emphasis on high-stakes testing matched with its myopic standards that are disguised in critical thinking. I've seen my daughter's kindergarten and first grade assignments. This isn't critical thinking. This is developmentally inappropriate rote. You think they could fool me with this stuff? Any education reform that doesn't address high-stakes testing and the non-cognitive factors of true success like character and integrity is a complete waste of time. It's killing our kids.
And what I really like about what he said is we took the educational system that put a man on the moon with less technology than is in your cell phone, and we characterized it as failure. Why? And what characterized it as failure? It was these tests, right? These insipid, endless, myopic tests. And why do you think they characterize them that way? Because if the system's a failure, you have to keep inventing it every couple years. And you need more tests and different textbooks. What he said is exactly right. There is no money in long-term student success. We've been doing math the same way for about 2,500 years. And it has given us Archimedes, and it's given us Newton, and it's given us Einstein, although he didn't do all that well in math. But it gave us him anyway. And it works. What are we reinventing the wheel for? Other than to keep having new textbooks, new pedagogy, all this other stuff that has nothing to do with education, all driven by private corporations and testing companies who profit from failure. There is no money in a textbook. You get a good math textbook, why should you change it for 100 years? If it teaches kids how to do the math and does it efficiently, why change? But there's no money to be made in that. There's the quote I told you about. You tell me how you read him any different than what he said. Bill Gates said, in 2009 he said, when the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum lines up as well. You haven't had that alignment yet. You're about to get it. And when New York got its alignment, their kids fell in reading and math from the 79th percentile all the way down to the 30th. And that's what happened in Florida, and that's what happened in Kentucky. And so now what are you going to have to do to fix that huge fall? You're going to have to do more Common Core, right? And do these Common Core tests actually measure your kids' ability to do math and to read, or do they measure their ability to do Common Core math and Common Core reading? They're not the same thing, right? There's the man. So you've heard Joshua Katz, right? You've heard Bill Gates. You've heard Eitel and Talbert. You're hearing from a lot of, Karen Lewis, the New York Teachers Union, the NEA president. You're hearing from a lot of people, none of whom can be characterized as simple-minded right-wingers. This, they don't want to talk about either. So what about the standards? Let's talk about the standards. I promise, this is the last one. One last little history lesson. The Common Core people did one other thing that you might be tempted to see as a wonderful thing. After they had the standards had been paid for, they'd been drafted, they were revised, Race to the Top had put it in most of the states. After all that happened, the Common Core people created what was known as the Validation Committee. They put together a committee of people whose job it was, on the outside, to come to Washington, to look over the standards. This committee was given full latitude to throw the standards out if they weren't any good, to completely revise them. This committee consisted of 29 people. About 14 of them were nothing but political activists with no educational theory or background. There were some low-level teachers, and that's not an insult. If you can teach 6th grade math, awesome. We need really good 6th grade math teachers. But that does not provide you enough math to write a national mathematics standard. In fact, on this 29-person validation committee, there was only one math expert and one English expert. That was it. The English expert lives in your own state, about a half an hour from here, Dr. Sandy Sosky. She is a retired ELA specialist who did most of her career in Arkansas and lives here now, retired in Massachusetts. She is considered if not one of the foremost experts on developmental English in this country. She voted no. And said, and I quote, "These standards in writing and comprehension will set our kids 2 years behind the 2 years they're already behind the high-achieving countries of the world." Voted categorically no. The math professor is a retired mathematics professor from Stanford University, a man by the name of Professor James Milgram. This is a serious math guy. He did most of the mathematical computations for the Apollo moonshot in the late 60s. Right? And as Professor Milgram says, Milgram pointed out, there are only about 22 mathematicians in the country, 22, who could actually write a national standard. 22. And none of them were consulted on this. He voted absolutely no on the standard, and he said, and I quote, "It is an absolute joke to think that Common Core math will prepare your kids for STEM careers, science, technology, engineering, and math, or even college-level math." He voted no. Oh, here's another name for you to look up. One of the 5, Jason Zimba, Z-I-M-B-A. He is the chief architect of the math standards. He himself admitted about a month and a half ago in a newspaper, admitted in print, that it's true. Common Core math will not prepare your kids for college-level math, Zimba said. At best, the brightest of the students might be ready for math at a two-year technical college. That's the mouth of Jason Zimba. So Milgram and Sofsky, the only two experts, both voted no. Not only did they vote no, they convinced other people to vote no. And do you know what Common Core, the validation committee did? They wrote Milgram and Sofsky and all the others that objected right out of the final document. There is no mention of Milgram and Sofsky in the document. There is no mention of the other people who protested. It's all vanished. And the remaining validation committee members validated it unanimously. That you can find in 2 seconds on the internet. That's why Jim and Sandy have been traveling the country doing exactly what I'm doing. And they do it better because they were in the room. I'll give you one example. The Common Core math. You keep hearing from people who defend Common Core math that it has been internationally benchmarked against high-achieving math countries. Milgram, when they got to the committee, he said, okay, show me the countries. They handed Professor Milgram a list of about 13 different countries. And they were all the right countries, Sweden and South Korea, where they do math really well. Milgram said, great, it's a great list. Now, show me your math. And for the entire month, Milgram sat on that committee. They never once produced a shred of evidence that anything had ever happened by way of benchmarking. Not one, zero, zilch. In fact, Sandy said, I am convinced they didn't do any math, that they just wrote down a bunch of names on a piece of paper. Because no one anywhere has seen any benchmarking statistics. Nothing. No one. Absolute mum silence. That's another reason Milgram voted no. Now, this document here, this chart here, I put it together from my conversation with Sandy, right? And again, she's half an hour from here. Well, if you have any questions, there's another person you should listen to more than me, right? She'll come. She'll drive over here. She'll tell you what happened. She already been here? She's already been here. All right, then. All right. So this is derived from her information. What's one of the reasons we should be very, very concerned about Common Core English? Well, remember, the only answer to this is that they're just standards. No, they're not. The Common Core standards are standards. The standards are nothing without the feds putting them in your schools, and the standards themselves are meaningless without the curriculum and the pedagogy that's thrown up around them in the textbooks, most of which are Pearson. And we've already seen Pearson has a pretty big reason for doing this. The idea, if you're going to insist on separating those three things, then you should just leave them, because you're never going to get anything out of this talk. I'm just wasting your time. If, however, you recognize that there's no way these standards could be in your schools without the feds, if you realize now that the standards and the books work together, it's not like the Common Core people just in a vacuum did their good and noble work, right, and then walked away. And then all of a sudden, these predatory textbook companies came skipping around and corrupted the wonderful standards. This is all part and parcel of the same thing. And in Common Core, as Sandy points out, if she was here, she told you this, the big concern is how much literature is yanked out of English to be replaced with informational text, right? Common Core standards themselves require you read nothing. But what they did do, the Common Core standards, is they put together a list of books and texts that they call exemplar texts. And what are these? They're about 450 works that the Common Core Committee says we give a thumbs up to. Here are Common Core approved texts. There are exemplar texts. So just a quick question for you. What combination of texts, when the textbook companies put the books together, do you think they include in all the textbooks? It's some combination of the 450, isn't it? So, right, there's no collusion on this. And yes, is it technically true that Common Core requires you read nothing? The standard, yes. So where do you get the readings from? Well, the textbook. And who does the textbook? Pearson. And what combination of 450 books and texts do they all include? Yeah, you got it. The ones that the Common Core calls exemplars, right? So we can pretend they're not the same thing. I just don't think it's honest. And so what happens, Sandy says, is that up to 50% of the literature that your kids have historically read in English class gets yanked out in favor of highly politicized informational text. Sandy, by the way, is a good Yankee Democrat. She's no right-winger, right? So what do you get, as she said? More indoctrination within text, and a lot less discussion of characters, ethics, and morality. Furthermore, we know that kids learn how to read. Kids learn how to write well only after they first learn how to read well. It makes sense. When you go to learn a foreign language, you don't start writing it, you learn how to read it. Acquire vocabulary, syntax. Well, at every level of the curriculum, of the pedagogy that's put in these textbooks, and the philosophy of the people who wrote the standards, at every grade level, kids do more writing than they do reading, ultimately. So what are they writing about if they're not really reading all that much? Well, maybe that accounts for the assignment, like the one that came home in my state in Wisconsin that made national news. A group of third graders sent home to write an essay on how the state is just like the family but better. That was the assignment for the kids, right? These assignments where they're rewriting the Bill of Rights to get rid of the ones that are no longer relevant and add new ones, right? And Sandy points out, and she's exactly right. When you put your kids to bed, the objective, I would suppose, is to get them to go to sleep. So why, when you put your kids to bed, don't you read them Bill and Melinda Gates' computer manual? I mean, wouldn't that put them to sleep? But you don't. You read them stories, right? You read them stories that get their hearts fluttering and their little eyelids batting. You stimulate them, in other words. Because you know, and we've known for ever since 10,000 years ago, we've known that kids learn how to love to read through stories, through storytelling. Much of that storytelling is removed. Furthermore, by de-emphasizing literature to such a high degree, what you're also doing is you are disassociating kids from the 200-year arc of American literature. You know, that cohesive 200-year arc of American literature that socializes and ethnizes kids, exposes them to the struggle for liberty, flawed though they were, right? And all those books across the period, helping to create a particular American identity, or the great classics of the Western world, right? That reinforce Judeo-Christian values and tell the nature of Western culture over 2,000 years. All that now becomes a hodgepodge and a mishmash. And here are some of the exemplar texts. You can go look them up online. So when your son gets to 9th grade, he may be exposed to, how about this one? Recommended levels of insulation, a report released in 2010 by the EPA and the U.S. Department of Education. Sandy says the problem with so many of these informational texts is they are one-sided government propaganda. She estimates that about 35% of them are about man-made global warming and America's role in destroying the planet. And there is no other side, there's no this way or that way, there's none of this given. How about the next one for 10th graders? How about President Obama's own executive order? President Obama's executive order 13423, strengthening federal environmental, energy, and transportation management. How about the long essay on the evolution of the grocery bag? Spoiler alert, in case you want to rush home and get it, paper and plastic are both bad, and America's destroying the planet. Before I came out here a couple days ago, I gave a laptop in Wisconsin, and she's going to send them to me. So I'll put them up on the website, and you can add those too. A third grade mom showed up. She had 100 pages of dystopian literature for her third grade kid. There were about 16 different short stories. They had spent a month and a half in English class on these stories. The entire premise of all 16 short stories was that America had destroyed the world because of global warming. And in the wake of that Armageddon caused by America, all sorts of rape and incest and cannibalism were taking place. All of this described in absolutely graphic detail. I've seen them. The mom had 100 pages of that for the third graders, right? And even worse than this, Sandy says, and you can look this up easily, given what little literature, relatively speaking, is left in the curriculum, why is so much of it sexually inappropriate, developmentally inappropriate? Why? This is just one book. This is the most famous example, but there are books like Dreaming in Cuban and Black Swan, dozens of them actually, that are sexually, developmentally inappropriate in shocking ways. This is Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. She is a fantastic writer, African-American novelist. She won a Nobel Prize. But we wouldn't teach this book to freshmen in college. This is a book about a 12-year-old girl who is the victim of rape and incest and comes to bond with her rapist and describes in staggering detail the nature of their sexual encounters. This book has been found in Common Core classrooms for kids as young as 8th grade, middle school. It's also been present, and when you think about why that is, they don't put the whole book, you don't buy whole books in Common Core classrooms. You buy these amalgamated collections of essays and novels and fragments of poems, right? So even if you don't, I'm not saying that these schools all set out to buy this book. I'm saying it routinely ends up in the Common Core workbook. And so consequently, I bleeped out all the bad words, but you need to at least take a look. Here are some, well, you can't see this, can you? That's probably good. These are some exceedingly graphic passages. I'm not going to read them. If at the end of the talk you'd like to come up and get a better look. But they're all over the internet, too. Books like Black Swan, Dreaming in Cuban. Give you an example in Common Core English. This has also been in the news in the last 2 weeks. There's a famous example now of an assignment that went home, again, I think it was for 4th or 5th graders. You can check that. I think it was 5th graders. 5th graders were sent home with a homework assignment in English class. And that homework assignment was to read 8 or 9 sentences and then determine what the context of the paragraph is, what the meaning of the paragraph is from those 8 sentences. That was the assignment. The sentences, the 8 sentences began, Janie's mom comes home from school. Janie's mom discovers that Dad had again forgotten to make the bed. Janie's mom makes the bed and discovers in the bed a hair beret that is not hers. And by the end of the 8 sentences, without ever being told what's going on, the kids are supposed to conclude that Dad's having an adulterous affair in Mom's bed. And these are not outliers. If you just simply type in bad Common Core English example or bad Common Core math example, you're going to find hundreds and hundreds. How many of you know who the comedian Louis C.K. is? Yeah. Did you see him on David Letterman? David Letterman, for God's sake, a couple of weeks ago with his kids' math homework. And these guys are big-time Hollywood liberals, both of them, and they spent a half hour mocking and ridiculing this stuff. You can find these examples all over the place. And inevitably, when you bring this kind of stuff up, even if you find, I have no idea what goes on in Shrewsbury, I'm sure it's a great school, but when moms and dads across the country find these things in their kids' curriculum, they bring it to the teachers, they bring it to the principal, superintendent, and they're told the same thing. Well, that's not Common Core's fault. That's just a bad assignment, and we'll make sure it doesn't, and that's all that ever happens. But I would argue, as Sandy argued, this kind of developmentally inappropriate stuff, it is not a design flaw. It is the purpose. I'm going to let this hang for about 5 minutes. We'll come back to this. The question is, there's Sandy. She asks it. Why? We need to explore why so many of these exemplar texts are out of place, not just in the subject area Common Core places them, but in a high school curriculum altogether. You have to understand that philosophically, if they're putting these things in the way they're putting them in, it's not an accident. It's not just a casual bad choice. Do you honestly think the Common Core Validation Committee, the Common Core Committee, picked their exemplar text without careful forethought? It's inconceivable, right? And again, Sandy, in the room when all this happened. And let's also be clear about one thing. They called her. She didn't apply for the job. They sought her out at the Common Core Committee to validate their standards. Same thing with Professor Milgram. And then what about math? Well, in talking to Professor Milgram, right, trying to figure this out, and by the way, Milgram, too, is a Democrat, number one, and two, he's not opposed to standards. He just thinks these ones are horrible. I would disagree with him on that. But he's not, in theory, opposed to standards. He just thinks these ones are garbage. He actually likes Massachusetts standards, the ones he used to have. He doesn't really like them. So in talking to him about this, I said, well, what's going on here? You were on that committee all the time. What happened? Why are they doing this math? And I'm sure many of you have seen the absolutely convoluted way that Common Core does math. And you can find thousands of examples. I'll show you one, but you can see them. So Milgram pointed to this, right? This is a community activist organizer from Chicago talking to a group of high school math teachers about the philosophy of Common Core.
But even under the new Common Core, even if they said 3 times 4 was 11, if they were able to explain their reasoning and explain how they came up with their answer really in words and oral explanations, and they showed it in the picture, but they just got the final number wrong, we're really more focusing on the how and the way we...
And to be fair to this lady, you can find this stuff online too. She is asked later in the short clip, but please, tell us the right answers matter. And she says again, well, of course, but not as much as the process. And Milgram says that's it, that this is a math curriculum designed not to let the kids, and let's be honest, Milgram said, not every going to be good at math. It's a hard thing. Math is a lot harder than a lot of other subjects. The idea that every kid is going to be equally proficient, and we would want every kid to be equally proficient, is absurd. This is a math curriculum, he said, that is designed to make everybody comfortable with the math they can do, not to encourage really good math kids to excel. And so he directed me to one of many videos. He gave me a list of about 50. This is just one of them. A young girl, and why did he give me this one? Because this is a very interesting story. The woman, the mother in this video, has a high degree of math. She's a former student of Professor Milgram. She's a very serious math person, and she can't help her third grade math. She can't help her third grade student with her math homework. Right, so she puts the kid up at the whiteboard, has the kid work the problem, right? And so we'll talk about it shortly when it's over. And again, I don't have time to show you 100, or I would. You can find them online if you look for them, but this is just one. Here's the difficult math problem. You're going to add three numbers, 1568, 1423, and 680.
So what I want you to do is, can you solve that problem showing me the way that you learned how to solve it in school? And talk to me while you're solving it.
So you learn that a big square like this is 100. Now, we could make that 100 into a cube, which would make a 1,000. So I'm going to do that. So let's just say that's 1,000. And now we still have 500. So we got to 5 sheets.
So the first thing we notice is that nobody's adding anything yet. This is just what you got to do to get the numbers on the board.
And then that's 60. So it's not 10. For the first thing,
So the cubes are 1,000, the squares are 100, the lines equal tens, and the dots equal ones. Now you've got to get the second number on the board.
that represents what?
Okay.
And now we have to add all of these together. So you could make 1,000, all of these together is 400. Now you need 600 more. So now I'm going to write the numbers down. So we have 1,000. So let's just say 3,000. 3,000 plus 1. So now we can erase all the sheets and put them in text. Wow. We got the total of 3,766.
So that probably you just took about 8 minutes.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing in school. But that corner on top has a stack, and we're not allowed to do stuff.
Not allowed to do the stacking math of Common Core.
Okay.
And I'm going to stack some numbers, which is way easy.
The old-fashioned way.
What are you thinking? You're looking at your problem.
That's easy.
You got 2 different answers. What do you think happened?
Well, yeah, we can't figure it out.
Looks like you did the stacking correctly, and that took you about a minute.
So I think I did something that's good.
What do you think happened?
That was more confusing.
All right, out of the mouth of babes. Now, I do not want to be glib about this. I understand that there are some kids who learn in different ways. But if that's the case, why don't you teach them stacking math And then if you think other kids need broad, then do the other stuff, but you can't do it that way. And the frustrating thing about Common Core math is it's almost never done the same way twice. Sometimes it's squiggly lines and dots and dashes. Other times it's spiral. There was one famous example of an elementary school in Wisconsin. Of course, we're the dairy state in Wisconsin, where elementary kids were only allowed to add and subtract by drawing cows. That you had to draw enough cows so that you could count the legs of the respective cows to get whatever answer it is you were supposed to get. As Milgram points out, and by the way, this is especially true in places like Florida, New York, and Kentucky, where they've had it and this has been going on for a couple of years. The preferred method, Milgram said, in talking to Jason Zimba, the preferred method for math in elementary school is the parent share math paradigm, where kids at elementary school are put in little groups of 2 and 3, and they're given math problems. And the purpose of the assignment is not necessarily to get the right answer, it is to get every kid in that group to agree on what they think the answer is. And so you get ridiculous circumstances like the one in New York City that I've got a copy of, actually. It's on the internet, of a little boy who writes on his 3rd grade math test, 6 times 7, he writes 42. He got it marked wrong. And in red pencil, next to the number, the teacher wrote, the other 2 children in your peer group agreed on a different answer. And so they got it right. Another little boy who, the answer to the question was 111. And rather than, he wrote 111 and didn't get credit because he didn't draw the 111 circles that were required for the math problem. And by the way, you don't have to believe me, because if you go to the website at the end I'm going to show you, you can go right to a page that will show you Stockby's entire testimony before the Wisconsin State Legislature, Milgram's entire testimony before the Wisconsin State Legislature. Milgram brings page after page after page of mathematical data on this stuff and shows it to the entire, when it's all said and done, it goes on for 2 hours. The entire committee has got their hands in their head, right? Because what are we going to do now, right? And there is so much independently documented evidence on this. Oh, one more thing Professor Milgram points out. In every high-achieving math country on Earth, every one of them, kids routinely start serious algebra in 7th grade or even 6th grade. In No Child Left Behind America, algebra is routinely put off until 8th grade. Under Common Core, Milgram points out, much of algebra is going to be reserved until 9th grade, freshman year in high school. And if that happens, how are your kids, that's why Jason Zimba admitted your kids won't be ready for college level math. If your kids aren't starting serious algebra until their freshman year of high school, how in the world are they going to get to calculus by the time they're seniors? There's no way. Where, Professor Milgram says, where are your doctors, your architects, and your engineers going to come from? Right? It's just not acceptable. And that is, by the way, if you don't like Milgram's 2-hour mathematical answer, then just take Jason Zimba's word for it. You know, he's the guy who put the standards together. Easy enough to find them. Oh, and remember what I told you? That when you have a standards-based system like this, a rigid and arbitrary standards-based system like this, it is just as dangerous for kids to exceed the standard as it is for them to fall behind it. In fact, kids who exceed the standard pose a much bigger problem than kids who fall behind. When kids fall behind, what do? Lower the standards. And by lowering them, and that's what happened for about 12 consecutive years in No Child. They kept lowering the standards because the whole system promised you results. And how do you get the results? How do you get more kids to the standard? You continually lower the standard. And that's been true of every permutation of this stuff. Goals 2000, going all the way back. Whatever standard you think you're starting with, they never end anywhere near where they're established. And Common Core won't even. It can't. That's the problem. The nature of these standards. In fact, a much bigger problem is when your kids excel the standards. Because if you got a bunch of kids going beyond the standards, that's going to yank up the standard, isn't it? And you're losing more kids. And so what's happening in American public schools, this is one of about 24 of these in the country. Actual school districts warning and threatening moms and dads not to have their kids do any more math than they're supposed to. This one, you can find them online too. This one is from the Irvine Unified School District, Orange County, California. The entire school district. What happened in California? You had moms and dads freaking out because in 4th grade, their sons and daughters were not able to add and subtract independently. They couldn't do it. So they started hiring tutors and having their kids work on extra math with this on the website. It is a warning and a threat. Here is the school district's warning. The links on this page are intended to support the classroom instruction that your child receives from his or her teacher. It is not appropriate to go ahead with the classroom instruction or to use this site to have your child work on math that is intended for use in subsequent grades. There's your warning. Here is your threat. Your child's math instruction and placement will not change as a result of working ahead. This means that your child will continue to work in the grade level appropriate math regardless of any work that is done and turned in. I don't care if your kid can do calculus in third grade. He stays in third grade. He does the same math as the other third graders. This is mind-boggling that you have American schools, and there are 24 in places like Colorado and Michigan that are threatening moms and dads with their kids this way, because you can't have kids going beyond the standard. You just can't have it. That should blow you away, that the schools now are more concerned about kids being within the standard range, ultimately, and no one's moving ahead. There will be no ability to place out of things. And that makes sense when the whole thing is driven by an arbitrary national standard whose main objective is not to produce high-achieving children, but to produce a basic comfort level, a very minimal comfort level that most kids can obtain. All right. Now, we're almost done. But the next segment here is arguably the shortest and will be done very soon. But whenever the federal government does something on a scale like this, there are always things that come with it that nobody expected would come with it. We now know in Obamacare, right, because of the national health care law, that there are a lot of things that are now being labeled health care that were never labeled that way before. Take, for instance, the way that they're now using the health care law as a way to begin to attack gun rights, right? Because the federal government's in control of health care, well, now guns are a health care issue. And that becomes an effective avenue to use the one federal program as a way to creep into others. Well, you've all heard about the data mining, right? Where does the data mining provision in Common Core come from? It doesn't come from the standards. They're just standards. It comes from race to the top. Simply by taking race to the top money, your states are obligated to report large quantities of data to the federal government on your kids. Give me an example in Wisconsin, my state. In Wisconsin, 2 months ago, the Wisconsin State Legislature set aside $7.1 million to begin in the fall the process of data mining Wisconsin school kids. Why? Because the race to the top mandate requires them to. And look, $7.1 million initially to begin data mining your kids, that does not mean they're just going to put your kid in the classroom and start asking them questions. Right? Now, to whom do we look? On whom do we blame this? Right? Is this Common Core? And I want you to be very clear what I'm telling you. There's nothing in the standards that requires any data mining. But the federal program that mandated the standards requires it. Where do you see separation between those two things? And consequently, this is the big facility they just built in Utah last year, multi-billion-dollar federal facility, where all your kids' data is going to be housed. This building, the people of Utah are so disgusted by this that they are trying to craft legislation to cut off water to the building. Now, and speaking of that, speaking for our environmentally conscious federal government, this building requires, it's all computers. It requires 1 million gallons of water a day just to cool those computers in the desert of Utah. What? Oh, very well insulated with that 1 million gallons of water, absolutely. And so you remember when we were kids, right? And the only thing that ever appeared on our transcripts was our final grade. But under this, what's going to be recorded? Every single assignment, every single teacher comment, every single teacher conduct comment, a detailed account of your kid's dyslexia or ADHD or the disruptiveness that it caused. And the federal government, yes, that federal government, already said they plan to make all those documents available to potential employers. So what? Under Obamacare, your kid is a child till he's 27, right? So at 28, when your kid goes to get his first job, it's always the smart audiences that laugh at that dumb joke, so congratulations. About half of the time, laugh at that joke, so good on you. But seriously, when your kid goes to apply for a job in a competitive market, you really want the employer to figure out what's going on in 6th grade and 8th grade? Do you know what Bill Gates has already said? Bill Gates, about 3 weeks ago, in a major national newspaper, Washington Post, I believe, called for data mining of college kids, too. We should start data mining college kids and track them for 10 years after they graduate, right? This is the technocracy at work, right? And so, here is a document written by the federal government, this is the Department of Education, and look at the date on the document. This is February of 2013, about a year ago, and that's the other thing. If this isn't a federal curriculum, a federal set of standards, if this isn't a federal initiative, why has so much stuff been written over the last 4 years to implement, promote, and support Common Core, right? That's the other red herring in all of this. It has nothing to do with us, they say, but they've been cranking this stuff out for years. And I want you to pay attention to the title of this document. This is their idea of how they're going to educate your kids. This is promoting grit, tenacity, and perseverance. These are the critical factors for educational success in the 21st century. Is that how you view education for your kids? As something that has to be persevered? As something that has to be endured, tenacious, just hang in there? When I hear the word grit, I always imagine John Wayne getting a bullet dug out of his side with a hot Bowie knife. Do you understand from what the little you've seen so far, why this would strip the joy of learning out? While this individuality, the ability for kids to follow their paths and become who they are, to figure out what their calling and their vocations are. Do you see how everything we've seen just might stomp that life right out of them? So I see where they get it. And if you turn to page 43 of this document, available online, you see this. These are but some of the ways they plan to biologically meter your kids' learning. Is any of this in Massachusetts? I doubt it. Am I sure none of it's in Wisconsin yet? Nope. But what do you think they just set that $7.1 million aside for? Oh, and by the way, in Wisconsin, more Republicans than Democrats voted for setting that money aside, just FYI. We're doing the whole bipartisan thing here. Scott Walker, Wisconsin. These are things that are in Florida, they are in New York, they are in Kentucky. They're also in, we know, places like Pennsylvania and California and Arizona already have some permutation of them. The one on the right, it's basically a blood pressure cuff. You put it around your wrist, it measures pulse, heart rate, blood pressure. Well, the creative geniuses have now manufactured them to fit little kids' wrists. Again, in New York City, 13-year-old girl, this became national news. 13-year-old girl in New York City, a year ago, actually a year and a half ago, came home from school and she had a kind of an angry purple bruise on her wrist. The only reason Mom knew. And Mom said, "What happened to you?" "Well, Mom, school nurse and one of the associate principals, vice principals, put her in a room, put one of those on her wrist. They obviously had it too tight. And asked dozens and dozens and dozens of questions, including questions like, did your parents vote? Did your parents vote? Did they vote in the last election? Who did they vote for in the last election? Are there guns in your house? Would you feel better if someone from the school helped you remove those guns? Are your parents divorced? This little girl's parents were divorced. Would you feel better if somebody from the school helped you live with the parent of your choice? And lots more. And you see what this thing becomes, right? It becomes kind of a very inefficient lie detector test. Are there changes in pulse and heart rate? What happens when you ask the question? The posture analysis piece, right? Have your kids sit in chairs that if certain subject themes or topics come up in class, do your kids slouch? They get nervous? The same thing with the pressure mouse that can measure how hard your kids grip the mouse at different times or how sweaty their hands become, and the facial expression camera. There has been actual school districts who've handed out school laptops and required students to use them, and every one of those had these in them. Whenever the laptop was up and the computer was turned on, a camera that the kids couldn't turn off began recording anybody who was watching the screen. And all of this gets dumped into your kid's data file, by the way. Now, am I telling you that someone sitting in the vice principal's office watching your 8-year-old daughter do her math homework? Of course not. What I'm telling you is, it's just like the NSA program. What are they doing with your phone calls? They're dumping a bunch of phone calls in files. And if somebody ever accuses you of being a terrorist, they can go into your file and see if they can reconstruct through phone calls the evil that you are up to. It's the same thing here. If for any reason, or for whatever reason, whatever they need to, they can go in. These computers that they're handing out, they all have keystroke recognition technology, which means every single key ever punched in that computer also becomes part of the data stream. And by the way, if this looks ridiculous to you, Bill Gates has over again, this is what he's planning. If this is ridiculous, you can shoot me who's telling you it, or you can get mad at Bill Gates, who's paying for it, right, and telling you exactly why he wants to do this stuff. And then there's this, the last part. I want you to tell me what this document means. I want you to tell me what it means. It's the National Sexuality Education Standards. So the fact that they're national means what? Who's in control of them? That has to be, right? The fact that they're standards means how are they ultimately going to be measured? Tests. There's no other way. And when you read this, you can go online and read this. 40 pages. Now, you asked me, Dr. Pesta, is this Common Core? I can't answer that completely. I'll tell you what I think, and I'll show you why I think it. I think you can say it is Common Core. I think you can say it might be Common Core. I think the one thing you cannot say is that it's not. Why do I say that? Look at the subtitle, first of all. These are the National Sexuality Education Standards. This is core content and skills. And by the way, when are they going to start teaching this stuff to your kids? When they're 5. Do you teach your 5-year-olds about this? No. Well, they're going to. Even if you don't think this is Common Core, or utterly unrelated, magically, it's the one and only thing in the last 5 years that the Department of Ed has turned out that's not Common Core. But then, look at this. When you go to page 6 of this document, page 6, you find this. This is how they wrote the standards and what they consulted. The National Sexuality Standards were further informed. What did they use to put them together? What did they consult? Well, look at the last thing on the list. The Common Core State Standards for English and Math. Why in the world are the National Sex Standards consulting with English and Math? This document was created and published by September of 2012, 2 years ago. Why in the world is the National Sexuality Standards, why are they consulting and informed by the Common Core State Standards for English and Math? What does the National Sexuality Curriculum have to do with math and English? And the simple fact is that these standards were never meant to be rolled out separately. You know, like Massachusetts, we get to take English, we get to take math, we'll adopt science. Oh, here come the sexuality standards, we won't take them. Because I guarantee you, if these were rolled out, standards, 49, I don't know about California, 49 states in the union would not take them. So these, by design, are meant to be folded into the existing Common Core standards. Remember that question I left hanging with you a little bit ago? Why is there, as Sandy says, why is there so much seemingly pointless, needless graphic sex or violence? Why is so much of what you see in Common Core so sexually and developmentally inappropriate? Does that maybe give you an answer? Now, I think in the final analysis, it doesn't even matter whether it is or not, although I think this is pretty damning evidence. Where are they going? And by the way, if you read this document, there is no place to teach it other than in English and math and science and health. And by the way, if you're going to get your kids to national standards on these topics, you can't just talk about it 10 minutes a day. And we don't put 5-year-olds in biology class, and we don't put 6-year-olds in sex ed class. How are they going to start teaching this stuff to your 5-year-olds? It has to be through the new Common Core pedagogy, and would that explain it? But I want you to be very clear. Pesta never said that this is Common Core. You should draw your own conclusion. I think you can say it is. I think you can say it might be, but you can't say it's not. And so let me show you some of the standards. They break your kids up into 3-year cycles. 5, 6, and 7-year-olds, test. 8, 9, and 10-year-olds, test, and so on and so forth. Here are some of the standards for your 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. And let me simply say this to you. I personally believe the federal government schools, public schools, should not be teaching your kids about sex. That's my view. Maybe I'm an extremist. But even if you want to argue, and people can debate this, if you want to argue, no, I want the school to teach my kids about sperm and eggs. I want my schools to teach kids about biology. Or I want my schools to teach kids about birth control. I would disagree, but okay, we'll talk about that. You're going to find that none of these standards, particularly for the very young kids, has anything to do with any of that stuff. This is pure sociology. There is no biological functions involved. There is no protection involved in these. So here are some of the standards for your 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. By the end of 2nd grade, by the time your daughter's 7, she will identify different kinds of family structures and demonstrate ways to show respect for different kinds of families. Now, I want my kids to respect all sorts of people. But what is the purpose of this in terms of sexuality education? And who gets to define what respect is? So your kids, why don't you teach your kids about homosexual marriage, gay marriage at 5 years old? Why don't you do that? Because you don't teach them much about heterosexual marriage either, do you? Because 5-year-olds can't process this. But what are they doing? By the time your daughter's 7 and in 2nd grade, she's going to have to be familiar with all different kinds of family structures. Homosexual marriage, heterosexual marriage, polyamorous marriage, single motherhood, single fatherhood. And she's going to have to demonstrate to the school's liking, to the standards liking, to respect all of those things to say. How about this by the time your daughter's 7? She's going to have to describe differences and similarities in how boys and girls may be expected to act. Because if math isn't right or wrong, then neither is biology. And there's no such thing we now know as gender, right? That boys and girls they don't exist. That what you have instead is the great continuum, right? And even if you believe that with all your heart and soul, how do you get this through to a 5-year-old? And remember what the Chicago Teachers Union said? Developmentally inappropriate. Remember what they said? Remember what Jonathan Katz, liberal teacher, Florida, USA, where they've already had this stuff? Developmentally inappropriate. It's because you can't teach kids that young this stuff. And why is this the school's business? Even if you want to concede that biology should be taught, or that birth control must be, education must exist. What does this have to do with any of that? This is what Milgram said it was. This is the state coming between you and your kids in terms of your rights and responsibilities, in terms of teaching your kids what you want about sexuality. There is no other way to define this. And Common Core, whether you like it or not, becomes the only mechanism we now have. If this was not about Common Core, why didn't they consult every other curriculum that was already there that wasn't Common Core? There's science curriculum in your schools that's not Common Core. There's history curriculum in your schools that's not Common Core. The sexuality standards did not consult them. They consulted only the 2 Common Core subjects that existed. What do you make of that? And so how about this? Do you understand this last section for a 7-year-old? Do you understand how ridiculous this is? You're going to have your kids at age 6 and 7 provide examples of how friends, family, media, society, and culture influence ways that boys and girls think they should act. You're going to send your kid to the internet for a sex and gender search at 6? We would not ask an open-ended, absurd question like that of kids in high school or even college. How about this by the time your kids are 10? By the time your kid reaches 5th grade, look at the second one on that list. By the time your kid is 10, before your kids even hit puberty, he and she are going to define sexual orientation as the romantic attraction of an individual to someone of the same gender or someone of a different gender. And that may be how you define it. That may be the way you want it defined. But is it their job to make your kid answer that question on a test for credit? To pass the standard? To be able to move forward? Because that's the other thing. Kids who don't meet the standard ultimately don't get to move ahead. You've got to meet the standard. That is not a subjective question. That is a question that, from their perspective, has one answer and one definition. What if you try to define it differently? What if you want to define it differently? There's no room for it. This is programming. And even worse than the standards as they're written is the way, taken directly from the document, is the way they plan to teach these standards to your kids. You're taken word for word from that section of the document. Instruction by qualified sexuality education teachers is essential for student achievement. So in other words, if your kids are going to be teaching this in classes like English and math, they're going to have to also be trained as they're learning how to be English and math teachers to accommodate sex in those subjects. It's already happening at some teacher colleges across the country. Kids who want to be English teachers in college, before they graduate and do their student teaching, they're starting to add modules in some of these schools that allow the kids to learn how to incorporate sex in that class. How about this? Students need opportunities to engage in active and cooperative learning strategies with regards to the standards. How about this? Sufficient time must be allocated for students to practice skills relating to sexuality education. How about this? You ask me what it means. We'll find out. You got to pass it before you find out what it is. How about that? How about this one? Students need multiple opportunities and a variety of assessment strategies to determine their achievement of the sexuality education standards and performance. if you think I'm playing with the quotes, if you think I'm cutting things off that shield this, then do what I told you to do. Go double check me, please, I beg you. Don't trust me. Go look. It will be worse than you see it here. All right. These are the standards. And even, remember, I'm the one who told you at the beginning of this talk, and we're just about done. I'm the one who told you at the beginning of this talk that Common Core is not necessarily new. That even if you manage to kill Common Core in Massachusetts schools tomorrow, you're still going to have most of these problems in your school. Why is it so imperative then to get rid of Common Core? Because of the top-down federal nature of this. If you're going to get rid of it, you better get rid of it now. Because once it makes its way through, you're not going to be able to pull it apart again. But even if you pull it apart, the stuff's going to linger on. And so what I'm about to show you is pretty shocking and pretty graphic, but I think you need to see it. The poster that I'm about to show you, it's a poster. It hangs on the wall in the front of the classroom right above the blackboard. It is hung there from the first day of the semester way back in August. First day of the semester way back in August. Every single day, kids in that classroom come in, and it was a middle school girl, a sixth grader, in that class who took the picture and brought it home to desk. Here is the picture as it hangs on the front of the board. How do people express their sexual feelings? This is in a middle school classroom. And so, in a way, this is a perfect microcosm of Common Core English, a perfect microcosm. Do you notice how they've got talking on there twice? Proofreading, grammar, spelling. What matters is the sociology, right? So here you have a poster. How do people express their sexual feelings? And did you know that saying I like you is a sexual feeling? Did you know that? Did you know that hugging is now sexual? Talking. Did you know talking twice is sexual? And notice the things that are put on the same poster with hugging and talking. We got anal sex and grinding and masturbation and vaginal intercourse. And do you notice how, for a public school system obsessed with birth control to the point of fetishization, there is not the slightest suggestion that some of these things might result in pregnancy, or that some of these things might result in disease? This is Kansas, people. It's not Boston. It's not hippy-dippy Madison, Wisconsin. It ain't Berkeley, California. This is the middle of the Bible Belt. The purpose of this poster for middle school kids is to convince them that if they object to any one thing on that board, they're objecting to all. And if they accept any one thing on that board, they have to accept all of them. You tell me what sexual purpose this serves, other than to break down traditional moral values, other than to remove things like modesty or chastity or humility from kids. This is a complete imposition between middle school kids and you. Oh, and what happened when Dad freaked out about this? Well, yeah, it gets even better. Here's the response that the school gave the next day. Here is Hopper Grove Middle School spokeswoman Leanne Neal from Shawnee, Kansas. And what did she say? The poster that you reference is actually part of our middle school health and science material, so it is part of our district-approved curriculum. Where did it come from? The National Sexuality Standards. The curriculum aligns with the national standards around those topics, and it's part of our curriculum in the school district, so there it stays. Again, if you want to make the argument that biology has a place in the schools, I want my kids to know biology. If you make the argument that birth control is important, I would part company with you to be taught in the schools, but okay, I can see your point. Don't agree with it. What does this have to do with any of that? What is the purpose of this? And that's what Milgram said. The problem with Common Core is it's pure sociology. Now, you're getting something that is exclusively me. I've shown you where I've gotten this stuff from. I'm going to tell you what I think right now, so you can quote me on this. I think the big problem with Common Core, for 40 years in this country, our kids have been learning their ABCs and their 1, 2, 3. And as they've been learning them, they've been pushed farther and farther to political points. That the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s are being taught, but as they're learning, they're also getting a decidedly political and ideological push. That seems obvious to anybody who's paying attention. What the difference between Common Core and what's gone before it is, I honestly believe that now the ideology is more important than the ABCs and 1, 2, 3. The primary purpose of Common Core is this stuff. Secondarily is the pedagogy.